Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Backer and welcome to my channel. Today we are going to talk about Thomas Pynchon's recent release, Shadow Ticket. I finished this a couple weeks ago, but I've still been chewing on it. Wasn't really sure what I thought about it, even though I absolutely loved it, in spite of low expectations, because I did not like Bleeding Edge very much. In fact, it's my least favorite book by Thomas Pynchon. All of his other books, I think, really blew me away. Really liked Shadow Ticket. I like how slim it is. I like that it's a lot of his themes that he's played with before dialed in. I love that there's no math in it. That's probably my least favorite thing that Thomas Pynchon does, even though I love Against the Day. Anytime they started getting into math, don't want to do it. Same with Mason and Dixon. I love as much of it as I've read, but I've always gotten stuck once they go to America and they sit down in this pub and start having these conversations about math. But let's talk about Shadow Ticket. So kind of the big picture that I noticed right away by reading this is that it feels very effortless. This is a guy that has been a master for years, and he's really showing off in this one in all of the best ways. I found that there's this kind of like roaming narrative eye where he does a thing that I believe is called zipper dialogue, where a character will be telling another character about a scene, and that dialogue is in the same scene as the scene that they're talking about. I think that Mario Vargas Llosa has done this. And I haven't read The Passenger by Cormac McCarthy, but I've heard that this technique is also used in this. It feels so easy for him. And I was surprised that it wasn't confusing because he does this throughout the novel, specifically when the protagonist Hicks McTaggart is talking to his lover and dance partner named April. It just felt really cool. And like I said, very effortless for him. I also noticed right off the bat that there was a kind of shift in the narrative about halfway through or 3/4 of the way through when they go to Fiume, which is I think it was a nation that no longer exists anymore. And that's a little hint at what I take to be the overall theme of Shadow Ticket, of this idea of these like remnants of these fallen worlds, just to kind of whet your palate before I get into some of this. But before I get into my analysis, I just wanted to share some things that jumped out to me in the book that I just found funny or interesting. So to start out, Lou Bassnight, if you've read Against the Day, he is featured in this. A good friend of mine that I have known on Instagram for a long time, but then just met recently at a Shadow Ticket event that I hosted, he pointed out in an Instagram review that this whole book might have actually just been like a leftover from Against the Day. I think the fact that Lou Bassnight appears in this could be evidence to that fact, or to that claim at the very least. But I don't know for certain. And I do know that Against the Day just feels like a bunch of maybe false starts on different novels. And even though I love that book and it has some of my favorite stuff in the world, it is messy and it does feel like just a bunch of different ideas jammed together that I could not possibly make sense of by the end, even though I enjoyed the details and the ride along the way. So let's get back to the details just in Shadow Ticket. At the beginning, there's a lot of stuff about bowling, and there's this scene on page 33, or not even a scene, but just a brief mention of a bowling ball hospital that different bowling balls have to go to, where after they get like warped by being in the oven, they're kind of pushed around on these tiny little gurneys for bowling balls. And I just thought that was like absurd, something that he would definitely do. I'm going to actually go through this kind of quick so I can dedicate more time to my analysis. On page 39, by the way, all these page numbers refer to the American hardback edition. But there's this very cartoonish mention of grill artists taking care of various counterside chores while whatever they're flipping is in the air, rotating end over end. I just thought that was hilarious. Obviously impossible, but it always just tickles me when Pynchon does those things. It's just like this little fun thing. Doesn't even have to be there, but it's a lot of fun. He mentions knee-high peach soda, which is a drink that I had at Boy Scout camp as a kid, and that's on page 43. I just that kind of gave me some nostalgia. Now, I also really liked this U-13 submarine in Lake Michigan with a bowling alley on it. I'm going to get back to that because it's very thematically important, but basically it is this submarine that's a leftover from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it serves as this little remnant of a lost world because, as you know, or you might not know, the Austro-Hungarian Empire does not exist anymore, but there is this still kind of like under the surface vessel that's going around kind of carrying on that legacy, which, as I said, is a bit of a theme here. So that really stuck out to me. I'll talk about that more in a second. There is an acronym here, SMEGMA, which I will not define, but it is the Semi-Military Entity Greater Milwaukee Area. That gave me a chuckle when I read that. Pynchon does this a lot. It kind of gives a silly acronym for a different agency, or the different agencies he covers. This just, I can't believe the editor let him do this. It's so stupid but hilarious. Alka-Seltzer is not about to name him Customer of the Year. You know, that almost feels like an MFA move, or like making fun of an MFA move of like just going out of your way to describe something in this really unconventional way. I also really enjoyed it. There's this scene when Hicks meets someone named Porfirio on a vessel or a ship called the Stupendica, I believe. I might be getting that name slightly wrong, but in the description, it says that Porfirio hauls out a high caliber cannon and blasts Hicks backward over the lifelines and into the sea and forgets to call man overboard. But then he goes, well, no, actually, Porfirio now seems to be pushing a wad of cash into Hicks's pocket. I just thought that was like super fun, where he's like, and then the main character dies. No, actually, he didn't, you know. It's just very playful in that classic Pynchonian way. This one I forgot to write a page number for, but Flounch, Daphne's fiance, after he fails to locate her by paying like $500,000 to this private detective business, or the money gets paid to someone, and then Hicks is kind of taking the lead on finding her. He like writes a book and does like a speaking tour, which felt very contemporary. And there are other examples in the book of these slightly contemporary things that he's setting back in the 1930s. So one, skipping down a bit, is the Gesichtsschule, which is basically Facebook, but it's like they go to this restaurant where they can sort of like video call each other with these different screens, and it's called like FaceTube, which I think is a pretty clear reference to Facebook today. I could be wrong, but there are some other contemporary references here, such as Daphne sitting on Bruno's lap. Daphne is Bruno's daughter, and I think this is a pretty clear nod to Ivanka sitting on Trump's lap. And a lot of Bruno Airmont's character, the Al Capone of cheese, I think is supposed to be a stand-in for Trump. I don't have the passage in front of me, but when I commented this reference, or when I posted this reference on Reddit, somebody pointed out that there's this passage. There's the reference to this passage of Bruno Airmont basically being like Trump, like being somebody who's not necessarily smart and basically acts like a child, but they have all of this power, which frustrates the people around them. So now I want to get into more of the themes around this, because I think that a lot of the theme is contained in the title Shadow Ticket, because Pynchon, even though he's very difficult to understand, I think in a lot of his books, he's sort of playing with the same idea, and that is that which is undocumented. And so for a private eye, a ticket is like an explanation of a case that they have to submit to their office. And so the shadow ticket is kind of like, what could you not submit? What could you not put into words? What could you not perfectly understand? And so a lot of the supernatural elements in this story, I think, drive the theme, because he has these really wonderful passages, and I'm not going to go through them all, but I did find quite a few that are just talking about like what kind of goes on outside of documented history. And as I mentioned before, that like U-13 submarine from the Austro-Hungarian Empire is the perfect example of this. And not to spoil too much, but on the very last page, that submarine gets brought up again. And to me, that's like a pretty clear indication that this is supposed to be a symbol, if I can go as far as to say that for Pynchon, of the idea of these little remnants of the fallen world, that after a nation has fallen or after an empire has fallen, there are going to be these little like tendrils, these little shadows of something that once was. But let's just talk big picture for a second. That, or actually for the U-boat, the specific quote on page 71 is a rogue Austro-Hungarian U-boat that refused to surrender, an outward and visible expression of paths not taken, personal and historical. Would that about sum it up? This is obviously kind of ironic, because that's like him just basically telling you the meaning of this. And if you guys don't know, an outward and visible expression kind of has like a religious connotation to it. In fact, that's what the definition of a sacrament is in the Catholic Church. It's probably the definition in other religions as well. But it's basically saying that like what a sacrament is like, it's got to be something that you can see. A sacrament is not a prayer, for example. It's not something you do internally. You have to like make a ritual of it. You have to burn some incense, the smells and bells. Okay, those are those like outward and visible signs. So then he's basically telling us here that that submarine is this expression, this physical thing of the path's not taken. And that path could have been like what the Austro-Hungarian Empire would have been if it didn't collapse, right? And so it's just out there swimming through the ether or underwater, literally, and sort of carrying on as a shadow of that fallen empire. Now, of course, Hicks also gets into this thing called the Oriental Attitude, which is this comic book-like understanding of Eastern spiritual wisdom. And it is something he pays 35 cents for. And so it definitely doesn't mean that Hicks is like a Zen master, but it just shows that he kind of flirts with these alternative ways of constructing meaning in order to understand himself. And this is sort of in contrast to the Gumshoes manual that he gets, or that he uses as a private eye. And to me, this is almost exactly the same as the way that the Baedeker, if I'm saying that correctly, is referred to in V, which is like an official travel guide to a country. And so in V, that gets kind of used to be like, this is what they put on the ticket, right? Or this is what sort of like the exoteric understanding of something might be, is what would be in the travel guide. And then, as you know, a lot of V is about kind of like what lurks under the surface. What are these myths that drive history beyond what we see on the surface? And so here and elsewhere, we get mentions of the Gumshoe manual, and then also frequent mention of where the Gumshoe manual falls short, where it's like the Gumshoe manual almost like shrugs its shoulders and it's like, we don't know what to do. This is kind of off the grid about what Hicks is supposed to do as a private eye. And a lot of that, just to kind of connect this to this idea of conspiracy that goes throughout most of Pynchon's novels, is that the tendrils of capital and the network of alliances are so shadowy and mysterious, you almost have to resort to supernatural means or unconventional means to understand them. And so a lot of this ends up being tarot, the occult. My favorite example is in The Crying of Lot 49, that Oedipa uses her lens of tears, or her ability to see the pain of the world, in order to understand this network of alliances within the conspiracy, because it is just too tangled and too difficult to understand logically through traditional means. So we also have this idea of asporting and apporting, which I just loved. The first example of this is when Hicks, as a strikebreaker in his past career, was about to kill this four-eyed Bolshevik, and right as he's about to bring the beaver tail down on his head and club him to death, it like disappears into this fallen world. And I'm just gonna like let the cat out of the bag now. I think that this is a theme, and even the kind of conclusion of the book, of that theme, of this idea that there is this kind of shadow dimension, that there's a lot of imagery here, that it's not just that there are these undocumented aspects of reality and these shadows of fallen empires and fallen nations, but it's almost as if there's an entire dimension that this stuff exists in. And that is something that I'm going to connect to some of his other writing in a second. So I think I've talked about as much of the supernatural themes just as I've wanted to here. So you know what, I'm actually just going to mention that now, that this idea of there being this dimension where like the pain of the world is stored, or all of the people from history that are like not important enough to get a monument or a mention of them in a history book. It's almost as if there's this dimension or this field of experience where they still reside. And the first mention of this that I saw in Shadow Ticket was on page 60 and 61, where Hicks dreams that he's here at an old country jailhouse haunted by the spirits of executed men and women, Black and Native American, and Stuffy is in the execution room. Hicks says that they took his heater and he feels that he's let Stuffy down. And so that's the first mention of this. But then throughout, there are a couple other mentions that build this case that I have, that there is like this dimension that's existing in this. And it's a little bit more than just like a theme or a creative imagery that he's playing with. Very briefly, this is also mentioned in Mason and Dixon, that there is like this field of experience where like the pain of all of these slaves is stored, or it resides. And that is just one of the most haunting pages or passages in any of his writing. And he is so goofy and so comical, but then he can just punch you in the gut with this idea of like, oh yeah, where does the pain of the world go for everyone that's like not important enough to be written down? It's just like very beautiful and haunting. It's like a known unknown that he makes more tangible by giving it this almost like dry academic or like scientific understanding, that it's like, it's not just an area, it's a field, right? It's something that you could almost like measure. It also reminds me of kind of what like Mount Daugen is measuring in V, that he has his like spherics that he's trying to pick up on, but then he starts to pick up on these like, he's not just like understanding waves anymore with his little instrument. It's almost as if these like spirits or these myths start to register on his scientific equipment. And so then 2 more passages here I think really establish this. So on page 145, it's a strange time we're in just now. One of those queer little passageways behind the scenery where popes make arrangements with fascists, and the needs of cold capitalist reality and those of adjoining ghost world come into rude contact. Many have been quick to blame it on the war, on the insupportable weight of so many dead and so many wrongs still unresolved. I mean, I think this is almost him just giving like a thesis statement to the book, that this is this kind of supernatural or religious element coming together with like fascism, and they're kind of clashing together in this rude contact with the ghost world, that the outward invisible signs of like the popes or religion, they're making arrangements with the way that capital and industry is organized through fascism and capitalism. But then there is this other dimension where things go that presumably get manifested in those outward invisible signs. And then this next passage, also on 145, it wasn't always a passage liner, Alf doesn't exactly explain. Converted during the war to a hospital ship, still populated by casualties, physical and psychical, and those in whose care they were conveyed. Unquiet stowaways with broken odds and ends of unfinished business from the war, common to all being, a hope no longer quite sure and certain that injustices would be addressed and all come right in the end. So I think this is on the Stupendica as well. That must be, because that's where Alf shows up. And yeah, just another example of that it's like, even on this ship that they're on, this used to be this other thing. This kind of reminds me of the idea of like hauntology, or the idea that there are these like kind of remnants of past meaning and significance in a lot of what we have. And it's physically something that is occurring on the ship, that there's like, they're basically partying on the ship, but then it's almost as if like still living in the walls, there are these literal dead spirits, but then also like their psychology is still there, or people that have like lost their minds. A psychical casualty is probably more what that means than a spirit. Great. So I've already mentioned that this U13 ends up being kind of the symbol for the lost world. And so I'm going to just go down a little bit. I'm going to talk about the end in just a second, but I want to talk about the character arc just for a second. Because this is, I think, often an anchor in Pynchon's writing, because there are so many different images and locations and new characters getting introduced, even up until the final chapters, that your head gets kind of twisted in a pretzel. But then I think focusing on the passages about Hicks can, or any protagonist of Pynchon, can often like root us and remind us like, oh yeah, this is a story. This is not just like creative nonfiction, which it can feel like sometimes with all these historical references. And it seems like the main thing they're trying to ask about Hicks is that like, can he change? Because he's frequently called a torpedo, which I believe is just somebody who like worked for big business and big industry as a strikebreaker. It might be less specific than that, but that was his specific background. And several times throughout, they keep asking like, oh, is the Oriental attitude going to eclipse this way of being for him, of him being this former strikebreaker? And they also call him a fascist at one point and say, oh, like you start off breaking up strikes. And then even by the end, which this is like literally less than 10 pages before the end, that somebody basically tells him like, hired torpedoes is all you ever know how to do, when Hicks is just asking this guy some casual questions. And so even if the characters in the novel don't believe that Hicks has changed, I think that Hicks does undergo a change just by becoming a political exile at the end. But it does seem to be a little ambiguous, because this last scene that he has with Terica, I think is how you say it, where it's demonstrated that he and she sort of fall in love or begin some romantic overtures at each other. And the ambiguity comes in this mention of a tomato, which is what they call like a woman you have a crush on. And she uses, I believe this is a Hungarian word, paradixum, which is Hungarian for, oh yeah, there we go, Hungarian for tomato and paradise. And they ask, like, which one is it? Is it the woman or is it the paradise? And they basically are like, that's too complicated to answer. Now, I'm going to try to connect this to the idea of him changing, that like by the fact that they don't know if she's offering him romance or this new paradise for him as an exile outside of the United States makes it so that maybe he doesn't change. And it's kind of for the reader's interpretation that by like going on this wild goose chase, does he finally find love and a replacement for April, his old dance partner? Or has he arrived in this new world outside of this like cheese empire, which is a metaphor for like the Western world at this time in history? I think that it's possible that he changes. And the reason I think that it might be paradise for him, or love with Terica, is that the very, very last scene, and this is a spoiler, is this letter that we get from Skeet, who is moving west to Los Angeles in order to sort of carry on the Private Eye legacy. And I take that to be that Hicks himself has sort of hung up his hat and he's not going to be a Private Eye anymore. And he's going to ambiguously be in this kind of no man's land, similar to this U-13 U-boat that is just this like remnant of this different era. And so while he's in exile, you get Skeet going out and sort of carrying on his legacy. I see that to be as some sort of a change for Hicks, that he might finally have a lasting romance outside of this unavailable woman. He is in this new area. That being said, it is a little unclear. And I think that is intentional. Like I said, with this ambiguity of whether paradixum refers to tomato or paradise. That was kind of rambly. I hope that that made sense, what I just explained right there. But basically, it's like he might have changed. We don't really know. Now, you guys, just to kind of land the plane here, because the video is getting kind of long, there are a lot of mentions just to what I had mentioned about the title, that the shadow ticket is just like anything that is undocumented. And so like there's a ton in this book that I did not talk about, but what I'm getting from this is that this is all just about that which remains after your nation, your empire, your way of life changes. Because even as Bruno gets whisked back to the United States, he is described as being like an exile. And they say something very Pynchonian, like, well, there's exiles and there's exiles, right? So like, even though physically he is not going to be banished from his country, he's coming back under different conditions where his cheese empire has fallen. And if this is connected to Donald Trump, this might be wishful thinking. This might be a prediction on Pynchon's part, but it's the idea that hopefully people in those positions of power that are controlling those tendrils of capital, the shadowy they behind the scenes, might at least be exiles in their own country as things shift. Now, that being said, historically in the 1930s, we know what's going to follow that. And so within the literal time period of the story, it seems like there's still a lot of rough work ahead for the United States. And I hope that that prediction doesn't necessarily mean the same thing for the analogous time period, which would be today. So I'm going to go ahead and end it there. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I felt like I didn't go too deep on anything. I just wanted to do a fast overview. I'm still chewing on what I think of this book. I loved it as a reader. My interpretation, I don't think, is quite complete yet. So I'm going to continue thinking about it. But thank you guys for watching, and you have a good day. Goodbye.